June 5, 1944. Château de la Roche-Guyon. The wind, a restless phantom of the coming tempest, lashed at the ancient stone, rattling the windows of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's headquarters. Inside, the Desert Fox, renowned for his audacious thrusts and brilliant maneuvers, found himself trapped in a different kind of strategic stalemate. He sat at his desk, not plotting a grand offensive, but wrestling with a gnawing unease that mirrored the churning channel beyond. Rommel was acutely aware that the formidable Atlantic Wall, a testament to immense German labor, was a shield with too many cracks. His intelligence reports, despite their inherent flaws, confirmed what his battlefield instinct screamed. The Allied invasion was imminent. Yet his hands were tied by a rigid, often absurd chain of command that extended directly to Hitler. He had tirelessly advocated for the forward deployment of vital armored reserves, believing that the invasion must be crushed on the beaches. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive," he famously declared. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. But his pleas had largely fallen on deaf ears. Divisions like the formidable Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, essential mobile reserves, remained under the direct control of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, far from the vulnerable Normandy coast. This dispersal was a consequence of Hitler's deeply flawed belief that an invasion could occur anywhere along the vast coastline, from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, and his personal conviction that the main thrust would come at the Pas de Calais. Rommel, a master of operational mobility, was witnessing his strategic vision choked by a centralized bureaucracy and the Führer's stubborn interference. He knew that without immediate armored counterattacks, any beachhead would solidify into an unbreakable fortress. This very night, as the storm gathered, Rommel was embarking for Germany to plead his case and to celebrate his wife's birthday. A decision born of frustration and a momentary lull in intelligence that would become a cruel twist of dramatic irony. General Feldmarschall Rommel's frantic journey to Germany underscored a deeper, systemic vulnerability within the very edifice designed to repel the Allied invasion, the Atlantic Wall. This colossal defensive network, stretching thousands of kilometers along the coast from Norway to the Franco-Spanish border, was Hitler's strategic gamble, a concrete behemoth intended to render Europe impregnable. Conceived as a bulwark against the inevitable, its construction represented an immense, almost unfathomable investment of resources and manpower by the Third Reich. From 1942 onwards, millions of cubic meters of concrete were poured into creating an intricate labyrinth of bunkers, pillboxes, observation posts, and artillery emplacements. The West Wall, as it was sometimes called, bristled with weaponry ranging from heavy naval guns to anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and elaborate beach obstacles designed to shred landing craft. Tens of thousands of German troops, often experienced veterans or dedicated coastal defense units, manned these fixed fortifications, their morale bolstered by the sheer scale of the defenses and the relentless drumbeat of propaganda asserting its invincibility. For many, this was indeed Fortress Europe, a shield against the democratic arsenal. However, beneath this impressive facade of steel and concrete, a fatal strategic chasm was already widening, highlighted by the arrival of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in late 1943. Tasked with inspecting and improving the wall, Rommel, a master of mobile warfare and audacious maneuver, immediately recognized its fundamental flaw. He famously stated, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome," articulating a profound understanding that the battle must be won on the beaches. His assessment was stark. The fixed defenses, however formidable, were utterly useless without strong, highly mobile armored reserves positioned directly behind the landing zones, capable of counterattacking immediately. This perspective brought him into direct and often acrimonious conflict with his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West. Von Rundstedt, a veteran of static, attritional warfare from World War I, advocated for a more conventional strategy, holding the armored divisions far inland, out of reach of Allied naval gunfire and air power, to launch a decisive, concentrated counteroffensive once the main Allied landing point had been identified. It was a classic clash of doctrines. Rommel's belief in preemptive defense and immediate annihilation of the invasion force versus von Rundstedt's preference for a grand strategic counterstroke. This disagreement, rooted in differing philosophies of war and exacerbated by Hitler's ultimate indecisive arbitration, meant that the Atlantic Wall, despite its physical might, possessed a fatal inherent vulnerability. It was a shield meticulously crafted, but one already riddled with strategic cracks before a single shot was fired. Even as the Allied armada disgorged its first waves onto the beaches of Normandy, a deeper, more insidious paralysis gripped the German high command. The Führer himself was asleep. The initial reports of paratrooper landings and naval bombardment filtered through a labyrinthian command structure, but the critical decisions regarding Germany's most potent reserves lay dormant, awaiting the awakening of Adolf Hitler. This wasn't merely a matter of deference, it was a strategically devastating fact. The German military architecture, designed to centralize all ultimate power in the hands of the Führer, became its greatest vulnerability on D-Day. Key panzer divisions, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the formidable Panzer Lehr Division, were designated as Führerreserve. Their deployment required Hitler's personal direct approval, an approval he was, at that crucial hour, incapable of granting. This system was a direct consequence of Hitler's increasing distrust of his generals and his belief that only his strategic genius could correctly interpret and react to the Allied intentions. This absolute authority created an agonizing bottleneck. The initial assessments from the front lines, desperate for immediate armored support to repel the beach landings, clashed with the rigid protocols of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of OB West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, found themselves trapped within this bureaucratic and autocratic snare. Their strategic philosophies for defending against invasion were already at odds, a fundamental division that further weakened the overall defense. Rommel, hardened by his experiences in North Africa against overwhelming Allied air superiority, famously declared, "The first 24 hours will be decisive." He vehemently advocated for a forward defense, believing the invasion had to be defeated directly on the beaches before the Allied forces could establish a secure foothold and leverage their immense logistic and air power. He understood that any significant counterattack inland would be decimated by Allied air interdiction before it could even reach the battlefield. His proposed deployment of panzer divisions close to the coast was designed for immediate, decisive engagement. Conversely, von Rundstedt, a more traditional proponent of mobile warfare, argued for holding the panzer reserves further inland. His strategy envisioned allowing the initial Allied landings to solidify somewhat, then launching a concentrated, overwhelming counterattack with fresh, uncommitted armored forces to crush the beachhead. This approach, while theoretically sound in a conventional land battle, disastrously underestimated the sheer scale of Allied air superiority and the devastating effect of naval gunfire that would prevent any large-scale German armored movement across the Norman countryside. The ongoing debate between these two senior commanders, coupled with Hitler's unyielding grip on the Führerreserve, meant that when the invasion finally came, Germany lacked a cohesive, unified defensive strategy, and critically, the immediate authority to deploy its most powerful fighting formations. This internal division, amplified by the Führer's sleep, transformed a heavily fortified coastline into a critical point of strategic paralysis. The strategic paralysis gripping the German high command was compounded by an almost unbelievable twist of fate that would echo with profound irony. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the very architect of the Atlantic Wall's coastal defenses and arguably the most dynamic commander in the West, was not at his post. On the evening of June 5, 1944, with gale-force winds and churning seas lashing the Channel coast, Rommel had departed for Germany. He was convinced that the ferocious weather would preclude any Allied landing for days, a natural barrier against the impending storm. His destination, first his home in Herrlian, to celebrate his wife Lucie's birthday on the 6th of June, a deeply personal commitment. From there, he intended to travel to a crucial meeting with Hitler, determined to impress upon the Führer the dire need for more panzer reserves to be moved closer to the coast. This decision, born of deeply flawed intelligence and a profound misreading of both the Channel's temperament and Allied resolve, represented a monumental gamble. Rommel, a commander famous for being at the sharp end, driving his forces from the front, had been caught in a rare moment of domesticity and strategic optimism, a confident miscalculation. As the first Allied paratroopers began to drop behind his lines, as the vast invasion fleet prepared to unleash its fury, the legendary Desert Fox was hundreds of miles away. His immediate authority and decisive presence, so critical in those opening hours, were utterly absent. This left a gaping void in the command structure of Army Group B. While his subordinates were competent, none possessed the Field Marshal's unique blend of tactical genius, moral authority, and the capacity for instant, high-level decision-making. The absence of this singular figure at the very genesis of the greatest amphibious invasion in history would prove to be a catastrophic impediment to any coherent German response, a tragic misstep whose repercussions would cascade across the battlefields of Normandy with devastating finality. The pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, plunged the German defenses into a maelstrom of confusion, a carefully orchestrated chaos designed to obscure the true spearhead of the Allied invasion. Across the Cotentin Peninsula and east of the Orne River, the night sky erupted with the fluttering descent of thousands of Allied paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division. Their landings were, by design and accident, widely scattered. Some dropped miles off target, others landed directly into German garrisons. But the cumulative effect was precisely what the Allies intended: widespread disruption, severed communications, and a profound tactical bewilderment across the German high command. This airborne pandemonium was the opening act of Operation Fortitude, the most ambitious and successful strategic deception in military history. For months, the Allies had meticulously crafted a phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by the formidable General George S. Patton, ostensibly massing in southeastern England. Their target, according to a torrent of fabricated radio traffic, double-agent dispatches, and cleverly constructed dummy airfields and landing craft, was the Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the English Channel, and therefore, in Hitler's rigid strategic calculus, the most logical invasion point. As reports of scattered paratrooper drops filtered into German headquarters, from Army Group B under Field Marshal Rommel to Oberbefehlhaber West under Field Marshal von Rundstedt, and ultimately to Hitler's bunker, they were interpreted through this pre-existing lens of deception. German intelligence, tragically for them, had been so thoroughly compromised and manipulated by agents like Garbo that they were primed to believe these landings were nothing more than a feint, a tactical diversion aimed at drawing reserves away from the real invasion, which they were convinced would still strike Pas de Calais.
This deeply ingrained conviction proved catastrophic. Vital panzer divisions, including the powerful 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, were held in reserve, awaiting the main event that would never materialize. The Supreme Commander himself, Adolf Hitler, possessed an almost messianic certainty regarding Pas de Calais, and his direct control over these critical armored formations meant that no significant countermove could be initiated without his personal approval. The initial reports from Normandy were thus dismissed as a mere sideshow, a probing attack to be dealt with by local forces. The Germans, paralyzed by their own rigid command structure and the psychological victory of fortitude, failed to recognize the true scale and intent of the unfolding D-Day invasion, setting the stage for a strategic blunder from which they would never recover. As dawn broke over the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, the initial confusion within the German High Command began to coalesce into a terrifying clarity. This was no feint. This was the invasion. Field commanders, faced with overwhelming Allied air and naval supremacy, immediately recognized the desperate need for their strategic mobile reserves, the formidable panzer divisions. Yet the very mechanism designed to safeguard these elite units, the Führerreserve, became an instrument of catastrophic paralysis. These divisions, the best of the Wehrmacht's armored might, were held under the direct, unyielding control of Adolf Hitler himself. Their deployment required his explicit personal approval. With every passing minute, the Allied bridgehead expanded, consolidated, and dug in, but in the critical hours following the initial landings, the German war machine remained frozen in place. Generals, whose training emphasized rapid, decisive counterattacks, found their hands tied, their strategic acumen rendered impotent by a singular, insurmountable obstacle. The Führer was asleep. The morning of D-Day found Hitler in a deep, medicated slumber at the Berghof, having retired late after an evening of discussions. His adjutants, keenly aware of his volatile temper and his absolute insistence on undisturbed rest, dared not wake him with news that might prove to be merely another Allied deception. Colonel General Alfred Jold, Chief of Operations for the OKW, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, despite receiving increasingly urgent reports from the front, chose to allow their supreme commander to sleep. The strategic calculus was clear. Waking Hitler prematurely risked incurring his wrath for a false alarm. Delaying, however, risked the entire Atlantic Wall. They chose the latter, a decision born of bureaucratic fear and the deeply ingrained culture of centralized authority. This agonizing delay, stretching for nearly 7 precious hours, proved to be an existential wound for the German defense. While the panzer commanders chafed, their tanks fueled and crews ready, the Allied forces systematically poured men and material onto the beaches, establishing robust defensive perimeters and pushing inland. Each tick of the clock represented hundreds, then thousands, of Allied soldiers and tons of equipment firmly entrenched in French soil. The strategic cost of this inflexible personal command structure was immeasurable. A robust counterattack, potentially capable of dislodging the nascent beachheads, was rendered impossible before it even began. The tactical window for a decisive German response slammed shut, not by enemy action, but by the rigid protocol of their own high command. If the sea had delivered the Allied spearhead onto the beaches of Normandy, the sky became the omnipresent hammer, systematically crushing any German attempt to respond. From dawn on June 6th, the Luftwaffe, already a shadow of its former self, was effectively swept from the skies, leaving the vast expanse above Western Europe to the overwhelming might of Allied tactical air forces. This wasn't merely air superiority, it was absolute aerial dominion, transforming the battlefield into an isolated cage for German ground forces.
Squadrons of Spitfires, Typhoons, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs operated with devastating efficiency, systematically isolating the invasion front. Their mission was clear: interdiction. Bridges across the Seine, the Orne, and countless smaller rivers became prime targets, collapsing under precision bombing and rocket attacks. Rail lines, vital arteries for German reinforcements, were relentlessly strafed and cut, their intricate networks reduced to twisted steel and shattered sleepers. Marshalling yards and supply depots, once bustling hubs of military logistics, were turned into infernos, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel and ammunition. For any German vehicle, be it a solitary motorcycle courier, a lumbering supply truck, or even a formidable Panther tank column, daylight movement became an act of suicidal desperation. Every road, every country lane, every open field was transformed into a death trap. The drone of approaching engines, often unseen until it was too late, would send men scrambling for the illusion of cover as fighters descended like birds of prey, their machine guns spitting ribbons of fire and their rockets tearing through armor and flesh alike. The psychological impact was profound. The constant threat from above bred a pervasive sense of futility and terror. Soldiers spoke of the sheer, primal fear of the unseen enemy, the deafening roar of engines, followed by the explosive impact of ordnance, leaving behind a trail of burning wrecks and mangled bodies. Rommel himself, acutely aware of this crippling disadvantage, famously lamented, "The enemy has complete air supremacy. He attacks anything that moves on the open road." This relentless aerial assault ensured that the already catastrophic logistical challenges faced by the German High Command were not merely exacerbated but rendered insurmountable, choking off the lifeblood of their defensive effort before it could even begin. For the German reinforcements, the journey to the front was not a strategic redeployment. It was an arduous, grinding ordeal of attrition that began the moment they left their garrisons. Units tasked with rapid counterattacks, often located mere dozens of kilometers from the invasion beaches, found their advanced planning utterly nullified by the Allies' absolute air superiority and their devastating interdiction campaign. What should have been a matter of hours stretched into days, transforming motorized divisions into paralytic columns struggling against an invisible, omnipresent enemy. Fuel, the very lifeblood of a modern mechanized army, quickly became a critical bottleneck. Convoys attempting to transport vital gasoline were systematically targeted, leaving tanks, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks marooned on roadsides, their crews reduced to helpless spectators as their intended battlefield evaporated. German quartermasters, accustomed to a degree of operational freedom in the earlier war years, found themselves battling a logistical nightmare of unprecedented scale. Major General Hermann von Oppen-Bronickowski of the 21st Panzer Division, positioned directly behind the invasion beaches, famously reported that his units, vital for any immediate counterthrust, were pinned down by incessant air attacks and could not move freely even at night. The infrastructure itself became a weapon in Allied hands. Bridges were shattered, railway lines pulverized, and roads cratered into impassable ruins. Engineers, already stretched thin, raced against time to repair damage under the constant threat of Hawker Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts, only to see their work undone moments later. This systematic dismantling of transport networks forced desperate measures. Many German infantry units, originally intended for swift mechanized transport, reverted to an anachronistic reliance on foot marches and horse-drawn carts, a stark and humiliating testament to the Allied chokehold on the skies.
Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, recounted harrowing journeys. A company of the 352nd Infantry Division, attempting to cover just 30 kilometers to reinforce Omaha Beach, took nearly 3 full days, constantly diving for cover from marauding fighter bombers. Their advance was a brutal stop-and-go crawl, punctuated by the screams of diving aircraft and the thunder of exploding ordnance. Night marches, once a tactical advantage, became a necessity, yet even under the cover of darkness, Allied night fighters and reconnaissance aircraft, coupled with partisan activity, made every kilometer a perilous gamble. The contrast between the meticulously planned rapid deployment schedules of the Wehrmacht and the brutal, humiliating reality of their advance to Normandy could not have been starker. Hitler's rigid command structure, which had withheld vital panzer reserves, now condemned those units that were released to a slow, agonizing death march, their strength sapped long before they ever glimpsed the invasion beaches. The liberation of men and material flowing into Normandy was not merely substantial, it was a logistical miracle, a stark testament to Allied industrial might and strategic foresight. Even as German units bled and struggled to contain the beachheads, across the Channel a different reality was unfolding. The ingenious Mulberry artificial harbors, conceived and constructed with audacious vision, began transforming the Normandy coast into a colossal artery of war. Within weeks, these modular ports, alongside the tireless shuttle of landing ship tanks, LSTs, and other amphibious craft, were disgorging an almost unfathomable torrent of combat power. By the end of August 1944, barely 2.5 months after D-Day, over 2.2 million Allied soldiers, 450,000 vehicles, and more than 4 million tons of supplies had been successfully landed and deployed. This relentless, uninterrupted flow ensured that Allied divisions, once ashore, possessed the fuel to advance, the ammunition to fight, and the replacements to maintain their strength, enabling a sustained offensive that steadily ground down German defenses. The contrast with the German logistical nightmare could not have been starker. Rommel, a master of mobile warfare, found his armies chained to the ground, not by enemy fire alone, but by a crippling scarcity of everything vital. Panzer divisions, the very spearhead of German might, became static targets, their formidable tanks starved for the thousands of gallons of fuel required for movement. Artillery batteries, once a fearsome deterrent, found their gun crews staring at empty crates, their thunder reduced to impotent silence. Replacements for the dead and wounded were a trickle, each casualty an irreplaceable loss in an attritional war that Germany could not win. The Allied air forces, with their unchallenged dominion over the skies, systematically interdicted every German attempt to resupply their front lines. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, and railway networks, the circulatory system of modern warfare, were utterly severed. A German division, requiring hundreds of tons of supplies daily to remain combat effective, frequently received only a fraction of that, sometimes nothing at all.
This wasn't merely a disadvantage, it was a systemic collapse, ensuring that every German tactical success, however fleeting, would inevitably unravel under the crushing weight of logistical starvation. The ability to wage industrial warfare had become the ultimate weapon, and in Normandy, the Allies wielded it with devastating, decisive force. As the Allied logistical juggernaut relentlessly disgorged its human and material cargo onto the shores of Normandy, a chilling realization began to permeate the German command structure. The initial shock of the invasion had given way to a dawning despair, particularly among the field commanders who bore the brunt of the Allied onslaught. They were not merely fighting a battle, they were witnessing the systemic unraveling of their war machine.
The pre-invasion confidence, built on the formidable Atlantic Wall and the perceived strength of their Panzer reserves, dissolved under a relentless cascade of Allied air power and overwhelming firepower. General Erich Marx, commander of the LX-84 Corps, whose sector included Omaha Beach, was among the first to grasp the catastrophic scale of the Allied advantage. Before his fatal wounding by an Allied fighter bomber on June 12, Marx had already conveyed to his superiors a profound sense of hopelessness. His reports were stark, detailing the ceaseless aerial bombardment and the paralysis of his movements. He understood that the battle was being dictated not by tactical brilliance, but by an insurmountable logistical chasm. The German command, rigid and centralized, struggled to respond with the necessary agility. Hitler's direct interference and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht's (OKW's) insistence on holding panzer divisions in reserve far from the front became a death knell. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, which was responsible for the Normandy sector, articulated the growing desperation to his staff. Every movement by day is impossible. Our supply lines are being systematically destroyed. Our tanks cannot move. Our artillery is silent for lack of ammunition. We are fighting with our hands tied behind our backs. This was not just a complaint. It was the pronouncement of an army slowly suffocating under the weight of an enemy it could not touch. The field commanders, men like Marx and Dahlmann, saw their meticulously planned defenses crumble, not always to direct infantry assault, but to the absence of their own reinforcements, the silence of their own artillery, and the constant presence of Allied aircraft. They realized that the war was not being lost solely on the beaches or in the hedgerows, but rather in the distant command bunkers where inflexible decisions were made, and in the ravaged supply depots where vital fuel and ammunition failed to arrive. It was a war of material, of industrial might, and in this arena, Germany was catastrophically outmatched. Their despair was the bitter fruit of this logistical reality, a realization that valor and tactical skill were tragically insufficient against an enemy that could simply outproduce, outsupply, and outfight them in every measurable metric. The initial paralysis and logistical disaster that plagued the German response to D-Day quickly cascaded into strategic catastrophes, first at Cherbourg, then culminating in the infamous Falaise Pocket. The port city of Cherbourg, a vital deep-water harbor on the Cotentin Peninsula, was an immediate strategic imperative for the Allies, crucial for sustaining the immense logistical demands of a continental campaign. Its capture was entrusted to the U.S. 7th Corps, who advanced relentlessly, isolating the city by June 18th. Despite robust fortifications and a determined defense by the German LX-84 Corps, the outcome was, in essence, predetermined. The German defenders, under General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, were increasingly isolated, cut off from resupply and reinforcement due to the suffocating Allied air superiority and the fractured German command structure. Rommel's desperate pleas for more fuel, ammunition, and air support went unanswered or were met with insufficient dribbles. Allied naval gunfire, including the devastating barrages from battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Glasgow, systematically pulverized German strongpoints, while constant aerial bombardment eroded both defenses and morale. By June 26th, after a brutal house-to-house fight, Cherbourg fell, a mere 3 weeks after D-Day. The capture of this crucial port, though heavily damaged by German demolitions, marked a profound strategic victory for the Allies and a crushing blow to German hopes of containing the invasion.
With Cherbourg secured, the Allied buildup accelerated, leading to the breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July with Operation Cobra. This massive offensive, spearheaded by General Patton's Third Army, tore through the thinly held German lines. In a desperate and ultimately suicidal attempt to cut off the Allied advance, Hitler, overriding his field commanders, ordered a counteroffensive at Mortain. Operation Lüttich, launched on August 7th, involved significant panzer formations but utterly lacked air cover and suffered from crippling fuel shortages. Allied air power, operating under the highly effective cab rank system, descended upon the German spearheads, turning the roads into a grotesque open-air shooting gallery. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, grimly recalled that our panzer divisions were decimated by the Allied air forces. This ill-fated counterattack, combined with the rapid Allied advance, created the conditions for one of the most devastating encirclements of the war, the Falaise Pocket. As Allied forces converged, British and Canadian armies drove south from Caen, while American and Free French forces swung north, threatening to trap the entire German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The pocket, a shrinking cauldron of destruction, encapsulated nearly 150,000 German soldiers by mid-August. What followed was an unprecedented slaughter. Allied fighter bombers, flying with near impunity, hammered every visible target, while artillery batteries rained down tons of high-explosive shells. The roads within the pocket became a choked, nightmarish landscape of burning vehicles, shattered artillery pieces, and dead and dying men and horses. The German escape route, the Falaise Gap, was relentlessly pounded. Accounts from both sides describe scenes of absolute pandemonium and carnage. General Omar Bradley famously described the pocket as a killing ground, while German soldiers recounted the terror of the constant aerial attacks, often with no cover or means of retaliation. By August 21st, when the gap was finally sealed, the Falaise Pocket was a graveyard. An estimated 10,000 German soldiers were killed, another 50,000 taken prisoner, and critically, a staggering number of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The remnants of the once proud German armies in Normandy staggered eastward, leaving behind a trail of utter devastation. These twin catastrophes, the rapid fall of Cherbourg and the decimation at Falaise, were not isolated incidents. They were the direct, undeniable consequences of the command paralysis, logistical failures, and overwhelming Allied industrial and air superiority that began on D-Day. They shattered the Wehrmacht's fighting capacity in the West and effectively sealed the fate of the German presence in France, clearing the path for the liberation of Paris and the Allied advance towards the Siegfried Line. The strategic and psychological devastation wrought by the D-Day campaign transcended mere tactical defeat. It stands as an enduring, brutal lesson in the perils of inflexible, centralized command and the absolute critical importance of modern logistics and overwhelming air superiority in shaping the outcome of grand strategy. Hitler's personal micromanagement, the High Command's doctrinal rigidity, and the Wehrmacht's inherent logistical fragility were not simply contributing factors to failure. They were systemic vulnerabilities that the Allied industrial might and combined arms doctrine ruthlessly exposed and exploited. For Germany, D-Day marked more than a catastrophic loss on the beaches of Normandy. It signified a profound ideological and organizational collapse. The long-held belief in the superiority of individual German tactical genius, of lightning, blitzkrieg maneuvers orchestrated by brilliant commanders, was utterly shattered by the relentless industrial-scale application of Allied power. The campaign signaled the definitive end of an era of warfare defined by isolated brilliance and the desperate, often futile, heroism of individual units. In its place dawned the era of total industrial war, where victory was inexorably tied to the capacity for mass production, the seamless coordination of vast resources, and the absolute dominance of the skies. The German command structure, paralyzed by its own internal contradictions and an inability to adapt to this new reality, watched helplessly as the Allied logistical juggernaut rolled unstoppably across France, forging a new paradigm for future conflict. The legacy of D-Day is therefore not merely the liberation of Europe, but a stark, indelible testament to the transformative power of modern warfare, where the factory floor became as vital as the battlefield, and the control of the air proved the ultimate arbiter of fate.